22 years on the bench. He had never been interrupted. Until that morning. Until that door opened. Let's go back. 22 years on the bench. He had never been interrupted. Until that morning. Until that door opened. Let's go back. The courtroom was the kind of room that makes people smaller. High ceilings. Dark wood panels. The particular silence of a space where decisions have been made for decades and the walls have absorbed every one of them. Nadia stood at the defendant's table in her dark Bordeaux hijab and her black suit, and she stood the way she always stood, completely upright, completely present. Beside her, David Chen had his files open. He had been her attorney for 3 years. He had seen her in difficult rooms before. He had never seen a room quite like this one. Judge Richard Calloway looked down at her from the bench. He had been looking at her since she entered. Not at her file. At her hijab. Richard Calloway had been appointed to the federal bench 22 years ago. In that time he had presided over 947 cases. He had never been reversed on appeal more than twice in the same year. He ran his courtroom the way certain men run things that belong to them, with complete efficiency and very little patience for deviation. He had a dress code. It was not written anywhere. It didn't need to be. Everyone who appeared before him knew it. And on this particular morning, looking down at Nadia's Bordeaux hijab from his elevated position behind the bench, he had decided that what he was seeing was a deviation. "Counsel," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who has not needed to raise it in 22 years because the room always goes quiet when he speaks. "Your client's head covering. It needs to come off. This court has standards of professional appearance and religious symbols are not appropriate in these proceedings." In the 4 seconds before she responded, Nadia did not think about the case. She thought about her mother, a woman who had raised 4 children in 2 countries and had written that letter on the night before Nadia's first court appearance 8 years ago. She thought about what it had cost her to get to this room. The years of law school. The nights studying while working. The quiet, daily discipline of being the person in every room who had to be twice as prepared as everyone else simply to be taken half as seriously. She had been in difficult rooms before. She knew what they felt like. She also knew something that Richard Calloway, in 22 years on the bench, had perhaps not yet learned, that the most powerful response to being made to feel small is not to shrink. It is to stand completely still and take up exactly the space you are entitled to. David Chen was on his feet before Nadia could respond. "Your Honor," he said. His voice was precise and unhurried. "With respect, ordering my client to remove her hijab would constitute a violation of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 as well as established precedent under the First Amendment. My client has a sincerely held religious belief that requires her to wear the hijab in public. This court does not have the authority to compel its removal." Judge Calloway looked at him over the rim of his glasses. "Counsel, I am well aware of the relevant statutes." "Then Your Honor will be aware," David said, "that this request, as made, is unlawful." The room was very quiet. The court reporter had stopped typing. 2 jurors in the back row had exchanged a glance. Calloway's jaw tightened in the particular way of a man who has not been contradicted in his own courtroom in a very long time. "I will recess for 15 minutes, he said tightly. "And I expect this matter to be resolved before we resume." He raised his gavel. And then the back door of the courtroom opened. The door was heavy. It opened slowly. The sound it made, that particular groan of old wood on old hinges, was loud enough in the sudden silence that every person in the room turned to look. The man who entered was in his early 70s. White-haired, slightly stooped, wearing a dark navy suit and a red tie that had seen better decades. He carried a black leather briefcase and he walked with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees were not what they were but whose presence filled a room the same way it always had. Nobody in the public gallery recognized him immediately. David Chen did. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, the particular shift of a man who has just seen an unexpected card appear on the table. Judge Calloway looked at the figure walking down the center aisle. And for the first time in 22 years, something crossed his face that was not authority. Stay with this moment. Because George Whitfield had not been in a courtroom in 4 years. He had retired from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals with a record that included 3 landmark First Amendment rulings. He had supervised Richard Calloway's appointment to the federal bench. He had written Calloway a letter of recommendation 22 years ago that had described him as one of the most promising judicial minds of his generation. And on this particular Tuesday morning, he had driven 40 minutes across the city, walked through security, signed in at the desk, and opened that door. Not because anyone asked him to. Because he had heard, through the particular network of people who know things in federal courthouses, what was happening in courtroom 7. And because George Whitfield, who had spent 50 years in American law, had one principle he had never once compromised, that the law means the same thing for everyone. Or it means nothing. George Whitfield walked to the front of the room. He nodded at David Chen. He looked at Nadia, at her Bordeaux hijab, at the way she was standing, at the expression on her face that was not defiance but something quieter and more durable than defiance. Then he turned to the bench. "Richard," he said. "Not Your Honor." "Richard." The room understood immediately what that meant. Calloway looked at him for a long moment. "George." His voice was careful. "This is an active proceeding." "I'm aware," Whitfield said. "I signed in at the desk." He set his briefcase down. "I'd like to observe, if the court permits." Another silence. Calloway looked at the room. At the jury. At the court reporter who had resumed typing. At Nadia, standing completely still in her Bordeaux hijab, not looking at Whitfield, not looking at Calloway, simply present and waiting. Then he looked back at George Whitfield, the man who had written his recommendation, who had built the framework of law that Calloway had spent 22 years applying, and something in the room shifted permanently. Judge Calloway set his gavel down. He removed his glasses. He looked at the document David Chen had placed on the bench during the recess, the RFRA citations, the First Amendment precedents, the case law going back 30 years. He put his glasses back on. The court reporter's fingers were still. The jury was watching. George Whitfield sat in the back row with his briefcase on his knees and his red tie slightly crooked and said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was the argument. "The court," Calloway said finally, "will withdraw the earlier request regarding the defendant's head covering." He did not apologize. Judges rarely do. But he said it. In open court. Into the record. David Chen wrote something in his notebook and did not look up. Nadia stood at the defendant's table in her dark Bordeaux hijab and she did not react. She had known, from the moment she walked into this room, that the law was on her side. What she had not known was that the man who had written the law's most important chapter on religious freedom would drive 40 minutes across the city on a Tuesday morning to make sure that was remembered. There is a version of this story where Nadia removes her hijab. Where she tells herself it is a practical decision. Where the room wins. That version exists. It happens more often than it should. This is not that version. This is the version where a woman stood completely still and took up exactly the space she was entitled to. Where an attorney knew the law well enough to say unlawful out loud in front of a judge. Where an old man in a navy suit and a crooked red tie drove 40 minutes because he believed that the law means the same thing for everyone. Or it means nothing. Nadia walked out of that courtroom the same person who walked in. Her Bordeaux hijab exactly where it had been when she entered. The case continued. The proceedings resumed. And Judge Richard Calloway, who had spent 22 years in a room that made people smaller, spent the rest of that Tuesday not quite the same size he had been when the morning began. That is the thing about principle. It does not need to announce itself. It simply walks through a door. And takes a seat in the back row. And waits.